Humanity's desperate last stand. The year was 2485, and humanity had reached the pinnacle of its technological achievements. Cities floated in the skies, diseases were almost extinct, and humans had begun colonizing distant planets. But all of that progress came crashing down the day the Vulture arrived. They were a ruthless alien species, towering beings with advanced technology and no regard for human life. They came without warning, attacking Earth and its colonies with terrifying precision. Humanity fought back with everything it had. Fleets of warships filled the skies, armed with the best weapons human engineers had ever built. On the ground, soldiers and civilians united, desperate to protect their home. But the Vulture were prepared for every strategy. Their ships were faster, their weapons stronger, and their soldiers nearly invincible. Earth's defenses crumbled one by one, and within weeks, humanity's armies were decimated. Amidst the chaos, a group of survivors gathered in the ruins of what was once a thriving city. Buildings lay in ashes, streets were littered with the remnants of a once bustling civilization, and the air smelled of smoke and despair. These survivors, a mix of scientists, soldiers, and civilians, refused to give up. They believed the humanity's story wasn't over yet, even if the rest of the galaxy thought otherwise. The Vulture didn't even bother to finish the job. After their victory, they mocked humanity, calling them a failed species, and left Earth behind. To the aliens, humans were no longer a threat. They believed the survivors would die off on their own, struggling on a planet stripped of its resources. But they underestimated the resilience of humanity. In the midst of the ruins, a small group of scavengers made a discovery that would change everything. Deep underground, hidden beneath layers of rubble, they found an ancient bunker. Inside, there were remnants of a secret human project, a weapon that had been designed long ago but never completed. The survivors gathered around the discovery, their faces lit with a mix of awe and hope. The weapon was no ordinary piece of technology. It was massive, resembling a sleek, dark spacecraft with glowing symbols etched into its surface. The words engraved on it read, "For humanity's survival." It was clear that this wasn't just a ship, it was humanity's last chance at revenge and survival. As they examined the weapon, a scientist named Dr. Elara Kane stepped forward. She was one of the few experts left who understood ancient human technology. Her hands trembled as she touched the ship's surface. "This isn't just a weapon," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "It's a message. Our ancestors built this for a time like this. They knew we'd face extinction one day." The survivors worked tirelessly to figure out how to activate the ship. Its systems were unlike anything they had seen before. It used energy sources that were no longer available on Earth, and its controls were so advanced that even Dr. Kane struggled to understand them. But they didn't give up. Day and night, they worked, driven by the belief that this weapon could be their salvation. As they worked, they were haunted by the memories of what they had lost. Families, friends, and entire cities were gone. But instead of breaking them, those memories fueled their determination. They wanted revenge, not just for themselves, but for everyone who had died in the invasion. One evening, as the survivors rested around a small fire, a young soldier named Dax spoke up. "Do you think we can really do this?" he asked, his voice shaky. "The Vulture destroyed everything. What chance do we have?" Dr. Kane looked at him, her eyes fierce. "They thought they destroyed everything," she said. "But they didn't destroy us. As long as we're alive, we have a chance, and we're going to show them what humanity is capable of." The group fell silent, her words sinking in. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about proving to the universe that humanity was stronger than anyone had ever imagined. As days turned into weeks, the survivors made progress. They managed to power up parts of the ship, and its systems began to hum with life. But with every step forward, new challenges arose. The ship's weapons were still offline, and its engines were barely functioning. The survivors needed parts that could only be found in alien-occupied territories. Despite the risks, they decided to go on a dangerous mission to retrieve what they needed. The story of their survival was just beginning, and they knew that every step forward would be a fight. But one thing was certain: humanity would not go down without a fight. The weapon, now dubbed the Phoenix, symbolized their hope. It was a reminder that even in the darkest of times, humanity's spirit could not be extinguished. And as the survivors prepared for what lay ahead, they made a silent vow to rise from the ashes and take back what was theirs. The Vaulter had made one fatal mistake. They had underestimated humanity. And soon, they would learn that when pushed to the edge, humans didn't just survive. They fought back. The will to survive. The wind howled through the broken skyscrapers, carrying the echoes of a world that once thrived. The stars above Earth seemed colder now, distant and indifferent to the struggles below. What once was a planet of bustling cities and glowing megastructures had become a graveyard of steel and stone. The Vaulter had left nothing but shadows behind. But shadows could hide dangerous things. Beneath the twisted remains of New London's skyline, humanity's will to survive flickered like an ember refusing to die. The survivors had built hidden settlements deep underground, using ancient tunnels and forgotten bunkers to stay hidden from alien patrols. They scavenged whatever they could find: scraps of metal, old batteries, food rations, anything that could keep them alive another day. Among these survivors was Commander Elias Ward, a war veteran with streaks of silver in his hair and eyes that had seen too much. He had fought during the Vaulter invasion, leading one of the last defensive fleets before their ships were torn apart. Now, Elias stood at the edge of a small underground settlement, watching as a group of young scouts returned from the ruins. One of the scouts, Lara Briggs, approached him with a grim expression. "We found more wreckage near the old military base," she said, pulling back the hood of her worn jacket. Her short hair was caked with dust, and her arms bore scratches from climbing through debris. "No weapons, but we found this." She handed Elias a rusted data core the size of a brick. It pulsed faintly with blue light. Elias turned the core in his hands. It was ancient human tech, probably decades old. "Could be useful," he muttered, motioning for her to follow him to the underground lab. The lab wasn't much, just a corner of the bunker filled with wires, monitors, and broken machines. At the center of it all sat Dr. Elara Kane, the group's lead scientist. Her once pristine lab coat was now stitched together from various fabrics, but her mind remained sharp. Elara glanced up as Elias and Lara entered, pushing aside a hologram she'd been studying. "Another core?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. Elias placed it on the table. "Could be something valuable." Elara smirked. "Everything's valuable when you're starving." She carefully connected the core to one of her makeshift computers. Sparks flew for a moment before the screen flickered to life. The core contained encrypted files, old records from the final days of Earth's defense network. As Elara scrolled through the data, her eyes widened. This isn't just old tech. These are schematics for the Arclight project." Elias's gaze sharpened. "The Arclight project? I thought that was a myth." Lara frowned. "What's the Arclight project?" Elara leaned back in her chair, the screen casting faint shadows across her face. It was humanity's last attempt to build a superweapon, something that could disable alien ships with a single blast. But the project was never finished. When the Vaulter attacked, the facility was destroyed and the weapon was lost. Elias crossed his arms, considering the information. If the Vaulter knew we were working on something like that, it explains why they didn't take any chances. Lara's voice was filled with uncertainty. "So what now? We've survived this long, but the Vaulter think we're no threat. If we start poking around for this weapon, they might come back and finish the job." Elias's eyes narrowed. "Let them come." His words hung in the air like iron. The survivors had lived in fear for too long, scraping by while the galaxy moved on without them. But Elias wasn't interested in survival anymore. He wanted more. "We're not scavengers. We're not ghosts. Elias continued, stepping closer to the group. "We are the last breath of humanity, and we're going to make sure the Vaulter remember that." Ilara exchanged a glance with him, then nodded slowly. She tapped a few keys, projecting the schematics in front of the entire group. "If we can rebuild this, even partially, it might give us a fighting chance." Lara crossed her arms. "We don't have the parts, or the power. How do you expect us to rebuild a weapon when we can barely keep the lights on?" Ilara smiled faintly. "The parts might be gone, but the knowledge isn't." She gestured toward the data core. Buried deep within the files was a map, coordinates leading to a forgotten human colony on Mars. It was one of the last outposts before the Vaulter wiped out communication networks. If there were still usable materials anywhere in the solar system, it would be there. Elias's expression hardened. "Then we go to Mars." The room fell silent for a moment before the other survivors nodded in agreement. For the first time in years, they felt something other than fear. They felt purpose. As preparations began, the survivors loaded supplies onto an old transport ship, a rusted relic that had somehow survived the invasion. Elias stood at the entrance, watching as the small crew boarded. Lyra tightened her gloves, glancing at him. "You sure this is worth the risk?" Elias smirked. "You know what they say about humans, Laura. We don't go quietly." With that, the engines roared to life. The ship lifted off the ground, piercing the clouds above, and disappearing into the cold, empty sky. Humanity's fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. The spark of hope. The transport ship sliced through the dark expanse of space, a lone vessel drifting quietly toward Mars. From the outside, it looked like nothing more than a relic of a forgotten era, scarred by war and time, its metal frame barely holding together. Inside, however, the hearts of its passengers burned with determination. This wasn't just a journey for parts. It was humanity's last gamble for survival. Elias Ward stood at the cockpit, watching Mars grow larger on the view screen. The planet's red surface stretched endlessly below, a barren reminder of humanity's old ambitions. Colonies once thrived here, but after the Vaulter's assault, Mars had been left to rot. If there was any hope left, it was buried beneath the sand. Entering atmosphere, Ilara's voice crackled from behind him. She sat at the co-pilot's seat, eyes flicking across the control panels. The ship shuddered violently as they descended, engines straining to keep the vessel steady. Lara appeared behind them, gripping the doorway for support. "I'm guessing smooth landings aren't part of the plan," she asked with a smirk. Elias didn't glance away from the window. "We're alive. That's smooth enough." With a final groan, the ship touched down on the dusty Martian soil, kicking up clouds of red dust. The engine sputtered and fell silent. Ilara powered down the controls and unbuckled her harness. "Let's hope Mars still has something worth salvaging." The crew stepped out into the cold Martian air, their breath fogging against the thin atmosphere. The colony lay ahead, or at least what remained of it. Outpost Theta was once a bustling hub for mining operations and military research, but now it resembled a graveyard of steel and stone. Elias led the way, his rifle strapped to his back. Even if the Vaulter had abandoned Mars, danger lurked everywhere. The outpost's outer defenses were torn apart, massive holes gaping in the walls where alien cannons had fired. The silence felt heavy, as if the planet itself was holding its breath. "This place gives me the creeps," Lara muttered, scanning the horizon. Ilara adjusted the portable scanner strapped to her wrist. "The data core pointed us here for a reason. Somewhere inside that facility is what we need to finish the weapon." As they approached the colony gates, the group paused. A massive pile of twisted metal blocked the entrance, remnants of human ships that had been shot down during the invasion. Elias gestured to Lara. "Help me clear this." Together, they began pulling apart the debris, revealing rusted walkways and shattered glass beneath. The entrance was barely holding together. Elias motioned for the others to follow as he squeezed through a narrow gap, stepping into the dark interior. Inside, the outpost felt like a tomb. Dust coated every surface, and the faint flicker of damaged lights cast eerie shadows along the corridor walls. Ilara activated her scanner, illuminating the path ahead. "Energy readings are faint," she reported, "but something's still operational deeper inside." The group pressed forward, moving carefully through the winding halls. They passed through abandoned barracks and shattered research labs, each room telling the story of humanity's last days on Mars. In one corner, Elias paused by a console covered in shattered glass. Faint holographic images flickered, photos of families, likely left behind by colonists who never made it out. Lara's voice broke the silence. They left everything behind. But why? Elias's expression darkened. Because they didn't have a choice. After hours of searching, the team reached the heart of the outpost, the central command chamber. At its center sat a massive vault door, its surface marked with the emblem of the Arclight Project. "This is it," Ilara whispered, stepping forward. Elias examined the door. It was sealed tightly, but a faint hum of energy vibrated through the ground beneath their feet. The vault wasn't just intact. It was still powered. Lara brushed dust off the control panel. "Think we can crack it open?" Ilara nodded. "Give me a few minutes." She set her tools down and began hacking into the ancient security system. Sparks flew as she bypassed the old codes, and slowly the vault began to groan. With a heavy shudder, the door slid open, revealing the chamber inside. The room was filled with machines. Rows of sleek, dark pods lined the walls, each one pulsing with faint blue light. At the center of the chamber stood the Arclight weapon, a towering structure of metal and energy coils. It was incomplete, but even in its dormant state, it radiated power. Lara let out a low whistle. "I've never seen anything like this." Ilara approached the weapon carefully, her eyes wide with awe. "This isn't just a ship. It's an entire war machine." Elias placed a hand on the cold metal surface. "Can we activate it?" Ilara hesitated, running calculations in her head. "It'll take time, and parts we don't have." Elias's jaw tightened. "Then we find the parts." Lara glanced at him. "You really think this thing will make a difference? Even if we get it running, it's just one weapon." Elias's eyes hardened. One weapon can change everything. As the group prepared to transport what parts they could, a distant rumble echoed through the facility. Dust cascaded from the ceiling, and the ground trembled beneath their feet. Lara's eyes widened. What was that? Ilara checked the scanner. "We're not alone." Through the shattered windows, they saw shadows moving across the Martian horizon. Vaulter scouts, drawn by the energy signature of the Arclight weapon. Elias's grip tightened around his rifle. "Looks like we're going to have company." Lara grinned, pulling her pistol free. About time. The survivors took their positions, the glow of the Arclight weapon humming behind them. The fight for Mars had just begun, and this time, humanity wasn't running. Humanity's secret weapon. The night on Mars was cold, far colder than any of them had anticipated. The ancient Martian wind cut through the cracks in the outpost's walls, and the stars above seemed endless, vast, and indifferent to the struggle of the small group of humans below. As the survivors secured the Arclight weapon within the outpost's central chamber, a quiet urgency began to settle in. They had located the weapon, an advanced machine unlike anything they had seen before, but the truth was clear. It was far from ready. The Arclight project, though powerful, had been abandoned at its critical stage, with key components still missing. The weapon was dormant, its systems unpowered and incomplete. Without the missing parts, the survivors couldn't use it to take on the Vaulter. Ilara Kane, the scientist leading the effort, was hard at work examining the machinery. The weapon's massive frame stood tall in the heart of the chamber, covered in a thick layer of Martian dust. Despite its size and imposing appearance, it was still nothing more than an inert husk of what it was meant to be. "I've seen nothing like this before," Ilara murmured, running her hands over the cool metal. "This is far beyond anything we've ever created." Elias Ward, ever the leader, stood with his arms crossed, observing the weapon from a distance. He didn't share her awe. While Ilara saw potential, Elias only saw another obstacle to overcome. To him, the weapon represented both humanity's last hope and the Vaulter's worst nightmare. If they could bring it to life, they might have a fighting chance, but the cost of failure was too great. They had already lost so much. "We don't have time to admire it," Elias said, his voice low but firm. "We need to activate it, and we need those parts, now." Ilara nodded, pulling up the holographic map of the outpost on the screen. She tapped a few buttons, searching for the schematics of the facility. The Arclight weapon uses a series of rare energy crystals. They're housed in an old research facility not far from here. If we're lucky, there might be a few left intact, but we'll need to get there fast. Lara Briggs, who had been standing nearby, checking her rifle, glanced up. "And if the Vaulter beat us to it?" Ilara sighed. "We'll have to make sure they don't." Elias's voice was cold, resolute. "We'll make sure they don't." The journey to the research facility was grueling. The Martian landscape was unforgiving. Vast deserts of red dust stretched out before them, with mountains and craters that looked like remnants of ancient battles. The transport ship, though functional, wasn't built for long journeys, and every mile felt like a test of endurance. The air was thin, the gravity weak, and every breath felt heavy in their lungs. But none of that mattered. All that mattered was the Arclight weapon and the pieces they needed to complete it. The group moved fast, sticking to the shadows of the massive craters to avoid detection. As they neared the research facility, the silence of Mars seemed deafening. There were no sounds of wildlife, no echoes of civilization. The planet felt like a dead world, and the only signs of life were the survivors themselves and the distant shadow of the Vaulter. When they reached the facility, it was clear that the Vaulter had already been there. The main entrance had been breached, and the building's security systems were offline. It had been a critical hub of research, housing some of the most advanced technology humanity had ever created, including the energy crystals needed to power the Arclight weapon. But now it was a tomb. "We have to be careful," Ilara whispered, her eyes scanning the darkened hallways through her visor. "The Vaulter could be anywhere." Elias nodded, leading the way through the facility. The doors were heavy, their mechanisms destroyed in the wake of the Vaulter's assault, but they managed to pry them open with minimal effort. Inside, the research facility was eerily quiet, with only the hum of ancient equipment filling the air. The team split up to search for the energy crystals. Time was critical now. If the Vaulter returned while they were still searching, they wouldn't stand a chance. Elias's mind raced. The Arclight weapon was their only chance at getting the Vaulter off their backs for good. But it was incomplete. Its power was still far too unstable. The energy crystals were the missing key. Hours passed as the survivors scoured the facility. Ilara moved through rooms of broken tech and destroyed data cores, while Lara searched the supply vaults for anything that could be useful. Elias took point, watching every shadow, every movement. They couldn't afford to let their guard down. Then, as they reached the heart of the facility's power grid, Ilara found it, hidden beneath a pile of debris, inside a sealed containment chamber. There it was. The last of the energy crystals, glowing faintly with an ethereal blue light. Ilara carefully extracted it from the containment unit, her hands trembling. "This is it," she whispered, holding it up for Elias to see. Elias's heart skipped a beat. This was the key, the missing piece of their puzzle. "We've got what we need," he said, his voice steady, though the adrenaline was beginning to build in his chest. "Let's get back to the outpost." But before they could make their exit, the ground trembled beneath them. The walls vibrated, and a distant roar echoed through the facility. The Vaulter were here. They had arrived far sooner than expected. Elias's eyes flicked to Lara. "We move now." Lara didn't hesitate. She pulled out her rifle and led the way, clearing the path as they rushed toward the exit. But it was too late. As they reached the outer chamber, they were met by a wall of Vulture soldiers, their massive forms blocking the door. The survivors had no choice but to fight. The battle was brutal. The Vulture were powerful, their weapons far more advanced than anything humanity had, but the survivors fought with the fury of those who had nothing left to lose. Elias and Lyra engaged the enemy head-on, while Ilara used her quick thinking to disable the facility's remaining systems, buying them precious time. In the chaos, one of the Vulture soldiers aimed their weapon directly at Ilara, but before the shot could be fired, Elias tackled the alien to the ground, disabling it with a brutal strike. With the last of the Vulture soldiers taken down, the group raced out of the facility and back to the transport ship. The energy crystal was safely secured. As the ship lifted off, the sounds of the Vulture's pursuit echoed in the distance, but they had what they needed. They had the power to finish what they had started. Elias looked out the window at the red planet below, the arc-light weapon's glow illuminating the ship's interior. The survivors had one last chance to strike back. And this time, nothing was going to stop them. The bold plan. As the transport ship soared through the empty void of space, the survivors found themselves in a moment of uneasy quiet. They had secured the final piece of the puzzle, the energy crystal that would power the arc-light weapon. But their mission was far from over. Time was slipping away, and the Vulture were far from finished with their hunt. Elias Ward stood by the ship's control panel, staring out the window at the stars, his mind calculating the risks ahead. They had narrowly escaped the Vulture's clutches on Mars. But that was only the beginning. The true battle was yet to come, and the odds were stacked against them. The arc-light weapon was their only hope. If they could get it functioning at full power, they could cripple the Vulture fleet, perhaps even destroy it entirely. But even with all the pieces in place, there were no guarantees. They were operating on a fragile thread. He turned toward the rest of the crew, who were gathered around the makeshift war room, looking over the maps and schematics of the arc-light weapon. Ilara Kane, still absorbed in her calculations, adjusted the scanner in front of her. Lyra Briggs, always ready for a fight, sat sharpening her weapons. Dax, the youngest of the group, was nervously pacing the room, his eyes darting from one face to the next. "This is it," Elias said, breaking the silence. His voice was calm but carried the weight of their situation. "We've got one shot at this, and there's no room for mistakes. We're going to strike the Vulture's command center in the Arax Nebula. It's their primary base of operations, and it's where they're coordinating their forces. If we can destroy it, we'll cripple their war effort and force them to retreat. They'll never underestimate humanity again." Lara looked up from her weapon. "The Arax Nebula. That's deep in Vulture-controlled space. It's a fortress. That's why we have to move fast," Elias responded. "The Vulture don't know we're coming. If we hit them now, we'll catch them off guard. But we don't have much time. We need to be in and out before they can mount a proper defense." Ilara cleared her throat, looking up from her tablet. "I've been running calculations for the past hour. The arc-light weapon will give us a huge advantage, but we'll need to get close enough to their fleet to use it effectively. The ship's targeting system still needs some fine-tuning, and the energy crystal has to be integrated perfectly. Without that, the weapon won't even fire." Elias nodded, deep in thought. "We'll have to be within range of their flagship, the Vulture Dominator. It's the largest ship in their fleet, and it's heavily guarded. But if we can disable it, we'll throw their whole command into disarray." Lara slammed her fist on the table. "I'm ready to go in guns blazing. But we need a distraction. The Vulture Dominator isn't going to sit still while we make our move." Elias glanced at Ilara, who was already poring over the weapon schematics. "Can we use the arc-light weapon to create that distraction?" "It's possible," she said, tapping a few commands into the system. "We can fire a series of EMP pulses from the weapon, causing a temporary blackout across their entire fleet. But the arc-light's range is limited, and the Vulture will realize what's happening once we fire. We'll only have a few minutes of confusion to get in position." Dax, who had been unusually quiet, spoke up. "How long do we have before they react?" "Maybe 10 minutes, Ilara said. "Less if they have any backup forces nearby." Elias looked around at the group. 10 minutes. That's our window. We hit them hard, fast, and we make sure the Vaulter know exactly who they're dealing with. Lara grinned. Now that's a plan I can get behind. Elias turned back to the viewport, staring at the vast blackness ahead. The Vaulter had underestimated humanity before. They had assumed that after the destruction of Earth, humanity would be nothing more than a memory. But they were wrong. The survivors aboard this ship were a testament to human resilience, and now they were about to strike back where it would hurt the most. As the ship's engines hummed to life, the crew began their final preparations. Ilara made the necessary adjustments to the arclight weapon, calibrating the energy crystal, and making sure the targeting system was as precise as possible. Lara double-checked her weapons and armor, ensuring she was ready for whatever lay ahead. Dax, though nervous, silently ran through his own training, knowing that this mission was their last chance. The time had come. Elias stepped up to the command seat. "All hands, prepare for the final assault. We're going to the Arax Nebula." The ship's thrusters roared to life, propelling them forward into the unknown. The stars blurred around them as they made the jump through hyperspace, the tension thick in the air. They had trained for this. They had prepared for this. And now, as they approached the heart of the Vaulter fleet, the survivors knew one thing for certain. There was no turning back. They were about to make the Vaulter feel the full force of humanity's wrath. As they neared the Arax Nebula, the enemy's fleet came into view. Hundreds of ships were docked around the Vaulter Dominator, which floated like a massive, menacing fortress in the heart of the fleet. The Vaulter hadn't noticed them yet. The survivors had arrived under the cover of darkness, and their ship was small enough to evade initial detection. "Prepare the arclight weapon," Elias ordered. "Ilara, are we ready?" Ilara adjusted the final controls, her fingers flying over the interface. "We're as ready as we'll ever be." The weapon is primed and locked onto their flagship. Lara pulled a lever, activating the ship's weapon systems. "This is it." Elias took a deep breath. "On my mark, we hit them with everything we got." The countdown began. They had 10 minutes. 10 minutes before the Vaulter knew they were coming. 10 minutes before humanity struck back. Humanity strikes back. The darkness of space had always been both a terrifying and peaceful thing. But as the survivors' ship sailed through the black void toward the heart of the Vaulter fleet, the quiet of the cosmos felt like the calm before a storm. Every heartbeat echoed in the small crew's ears, their minds focused on the task ahead. The stakes had never been higher. Elias Ward sat in the captain's seat, his hands steady on the controls. His eyes narrowed as the Vaulter Dominator grew larger in the distance, a towering behemoth of alien technology. Its surface shimmered with defensive shields, and its massive guns pointed outward, ready to unleash destruction on any approaching ship. Surrounding it, the Vaulter fleet moved in perfect unison, a wall of firepower that would crush anything foolish enough to challenge them. But humanity wasn't foolish. Humanity was resilient. Humanity was desperate. And humanity would not fall again. Targeting systems online. Ilara Kane's voice broke through the silence, calm yet filled with the urgency of the moment. "The arclight weapon is locked onto the Dominator. We're ready to fire." Elias gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Lara, you're in charge of the ship's defenses. Keep us alive until we make the shot." Lara Briggs didn't need any further instruction. Her hands were already moving, adjusting the ship's shields, preparing the last few defensive protocols. She had spent her entire life fighting. But now, this wasn't just a battle. This was a war for the survival of her species. Dax, the youngest of the survivors, was at the weapons console. His eyes flicked between the data screens, his fingers hovering over the firing controls. "We're too close, Elias. The Vaulter are going to pick us up any second. We'll be in their firing range before we know it. Elias turned to face him, his expression calm yet unwavering. "We'll be in their firing range whether we wait or not. We strike now. Hold your nerve." For a long moment, the crew did nothing but watch the enormous enemy fleet draw closer. The silence in the ship was almost suffocating, a heavy, tense weight that pressed down on each of them. Their mission had brought them here. They had come to fight for the future of humanity, and failure was not an option. As the ship approached the Vulture Dominator's perimeter, Elias's voice came through the intercom again. "Now, Ilara." In a flash, Ilara hit the activation button. The arc-light weapon hummed to life, and the air in the cockpit seemed to crackle with energy. A brilliant light erupted from the ship's belly, a blinding beam of blue light, sharp and powerful, lancing out into the darkness toward the Vulture flagship. The Vulture Dominator's shields flared in an attempt to block the blast, but the EMP pulse was too strong. It tore through their defenses as if they were made of paper. The Dominator's hull groaned in protest, and the entire Vulture fleet jolted as the shockwave spread outward, disabling their ship's systems in an instant. Elias gripped the controls tighter as the ship shuddered from the power of the weapon. The Vulture fleet was thrown into chaos. Systems flickered and failed across the enemy ships, causing some to drift aimlessly in space. Others fired wildly, their aim uncoordinated as their communication networks were severed. "We've done it," Ilara whispered, a faint smile of relief crossing her face. But Elias didn't share her smile. The job wasn't done yet. "Lara, full speed ahead. We can't let them recover," Elias ordered. The ship lurched forward, its engines flaring to life. The survivors' vessel shot past the now disabled Vulture fleet, dodging fire from the disoriented ships as it raced toward the heart of the Vulture Dominator. The huge flagship loomed before them, an intimidating presence even in its crippled state. But Elias had no intention of letting it survive. They needed to finish what they had started. "Target the core," Elias said, his voice cold with resolve. "Ilara, can you lock in on the core's power grid?" "I'm on it," Ilara replied, her fingers moving swiftly over the console. "I've got a clear shot at the core's core reactor. It's going to take one more EMP to finish them off." "Do it," Elias said without hesitation. Lara braced herself as the ship hurtled toward the massive Vulture ship. The sounds of enemy fire filled the air, but the survivors had become a blur of motion. Their focus was absolute. There was only one mission now: destroy the Vulture Dominator and cripple the Vulture fleet for good. With another pulse of energy, the arc-light weapon fired once more, and this time, the blast hit the heart of the Dominator. A shockwave of immense power radiated outward, and the massive Vulture ship began to crumble from the inside. Sparks and explosions tore through the structure, and the enormous vessel listed to one side, its hull splitting apart like a broken egg. "Direct hit," Ilara breathed, watching the redouts with a satisfied grin. "They're done." Elias watched as the Dominator began to break apart. The Vulture fleet, still stunned by the EMP waves, couldn't mount a defense. Ships drifted helplessly, unable to respond to this sudden chaos. But Elias knew that this was only the first step. "We've hit them hard," he said, "but they'll regroup. We need to get out of here now." Lara, never one to shy away from a fight, flicked a switch to engage the ship's warp drive. "I'm ready," she said, the ship's engines roaring in anticipation. "Warp drive engage. Hold on tight." The ship accelerated, rocketing through the debris of the shattered Vulture fleet. Around them, the alien ships spun out of control, some disintegrating as their systems failed completely. Others were left floating helplessly, their once mighty weapons useless. But as they made their escape, Elias couldn't help but feel a surge of triumph. They had done it. The Vulture had been dealt a blow they would never recover from. Humanity had struck back, and for the first time in a long while, the galaxy would remember that humanity was not to be underestimated. As the survivors sailed back into the relative safety of deep space, Elias allowed himself a moment to breathe. The battle was won, but the war was far from over. The Vaulter would rebuild, and humanity would need to keep fighting. But today they had reminded the universe of humanity's greatest strength, resilience. And as Elias looked around at his crew, the people who had fought and bled for this victory, he knew one thing for sure. Humanity had a future, and no one, not even the Vaulter, could ever take that away. The dawn of a new era. The silence of space was the only sound the survivors could hear as their ship drifted farther from the wreckage of the Vaulter fleet. Behind them, the once mighty Vaulter Dominator was nothing more than a broken shell, its shattered pieces drifting in the void. The rest of the fleet followed, disabled, and floating aimlessly, their systems crippled by the EMP blasts. Humanity had struck back, and the Vaulter had felt the force of that strike. But even in their victory, the survivors knew there was more work ahead. The war wasn't over. The Vaulter would regroup, rebuild, and retaliate. They had no illusion about the difficulty of the future. The galaxy was still a vast and dangerous place, and humanity's place in it was far from secure. Yet despite everything, they had won. And that victory was enough to ignite something far more important than just survival. Hope. Elias Ward stood at the cockpit, watching the stars pass by in slow motion. The ship hummed softly beneath him, the crew moving quietly around him, each member processing the enormity of what they had just accomplished. Their mission was over, but the journey was far from complete. The Vaulter were wounded, but not defeated. The battle they had won was only one part of the much larger war for humanity's future. Elara Kane entered the cockpit, her eyes tired but bright with the spark of accomplishment. She had been the one to bring the Arclight weapon online, to turn it into humanity's secret weapon. Now, as she looked out at the stars, the weight of their victory began to sink in. "We did it," she said, almost to herself. Elias nodded. "We did. But this is just the beginning." Behind them, Laura Briggs, who had spent the entire mission keeping the ship and the crew intact, leaned against the doorway. Her eyes were scanning the star map on the console, tracing their route back to the only home humanity had left, the last surviving Earth colony, which had been their base of operations for the last few years. She spoke without looking away from the screen. "We've got a long way to go. The Vaulter won't let this go easily. They'll try to regroup and rebuild. But we've made a statement." Elias turned to her, his expression resolute. "The galaxy won't forget what we've done. We're not just fighting for survival anymore. We're fighting for a future where we call the shots, not them." The ship's navigator, Dax, joined them in the cockpit, his youthful face tired but proud. He had been the one to initiate the escape, ensuring they made it out of the enemy's range and back to their hidden base. He had faced his fears head-on, and in doing so, had proven himself. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice laced with uncertainty. Elara smiled faintly, resting a hand on his shoulder. "Now, we rebuild. We need to ensure the Vaulter never get the chance to come back and finish what they started. We have technology, we have knowledge, and we have each other. Together, we can take the fight to them." Elias stepped forward, placing his hand on the console in front of him. He gazed out into the endless stretch of stars. The Earth colony was still a long way off, but in that moment, the journey ahead seemed filled with promise. The shadows of war had not been dispelled, but humanity had shown it was strong enough to face them. "We're going to need allies," he said, turning back to the crew. "We can't do this alone. We need to unite the survivors from every corner of the galaxy. There are other human colonies, other groups of resistance fighters, other species who share our desire to be free of the Vaulter's tyranny. We can make them see that humanity is not a species to be wiped out, but one to be reckoned with." Lara clenched her fists, a spark of defiance in her eyes. "Then let's do it. Let's show them the strength of humanity." Elara nodded. "It's time to take the fight beyond the stars. We've proven that we can survive. Now, we'll prove that we can thrive." The crew fell silent for a moment, each of them contemplating what lay ahead. They had won a victory, but the true challenge was yet to come. They would need to gather resources, strengthen their forces, and prepare for whatever came next. But they knew they weren't just fighting for themselves anymore. They were fighting for something far greater than survival. They were fighting for a legacy of resilience, of defiance, of humanity's unstoppable will to persevere. With renewed determination, the survivors set a course for the colony, knowing that they would be met with both celebration and sorrow. Earth had been lost, but the fight to restore humanity's place in the galaxy was far from over. There were more battles to be fought, more enemies to face, and more sacrifices to be made. But for the first time in years, they felt something they hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The dawn of a new era had begun, and humanity would be at the forefront, leading the charge into a future where they were no longer victims, but warriors. It was no longer about the past, the destruction, or the pain. It was about what came next, and as long as the survivors still breathed, they knew one thing for sure: the universe would never forget the name of humanity. The universe would never forget what it meant to face the impossible, rise from the ashes, and fight until the last breath. And that fight was just beginning.